Welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for collective liberation. I'm Aaron.
And I'm Damien. Thank you so much for joining us today. Each week, we'll bring something new to the table and discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. Damien, you're up this week, and I think we have a very special episode today.
Yeah.
So what are you bringing to the table today, Damien?
Yeah, so I have brought our February book to the table for us to talk about today. But before we get into that, we do have a very special episode today. We've got an amazing guest joining us on the podcast. And in addition to that, we're recording this episode live from the 2026 Maryland Student Affairs Conference at the University of Maryland. So shout out to Maryland. So yeah. And we've got guests, as our listeners can hear. What a day it's been. So we're thrilled and honored to be joined today by Stephanie Olson. Welcome, Stephanie. Stephanie is not only our friend, but she's also a colleague. Aaron and Stephanie currently work together in the same department here at Maryland, and Stephanie and I used to work together, and Aaron, in that same office, same department. So before we get into the book, we'd love for you to introduce yourself to our listeners, Stephanie. How about that?
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Stephanie. I use she, her pronouns. My work focuses on learning and belonging, especially how we can support students and staff as whole people. I'm also a doctoral student in an educational leadership program studying how DEI educators design learning experiences while navigating institutional barriers and caring for themselves in the process. A lot of my work and passions sit at the intersection of equity, adult learning, restorative practices, and engaging facilitation. Basically, how can we create spaces where people can pause, breathe, and then really learn and grow and have hard conversations without shutting down or burning out? My perspective is shaped by my positionality as both a practitioner and now as a researcher, as well as my social identities, my most salient being a white cisgender woman who is a wife, a dog mom, a daughter, and a friend. And I am really looking forward to digging into this conversation with y'all.
Yeah, welcome to the podcast, Stephanie. I'm excited you're here. Should we start talking about this book?
Let's do it. Yeah. All right, so as I've mentioned, we are going to talk about our February book today. The book is called Black History is for Everyone. It was written by Brian Jones and published by Haymarket Books just this past September. And this was a really incredible book. Aaron's got a prop to show. I encourage everyone to read it and to check it out. Brian Jones provides a really thorough analysis of how teaching, learning, and applying Black history and the lessons from Black history can shape our understanding of ourselves and the world and our ongoing struggles for social justice and collective liberation. And he does this in a couple of ways, actually a lot of different ways. First, he uses his own lived experiences and reflections about those experiences throughout his life and throughout his work as an educator, which I thought made the book really approachable.
Oh, yeah.
And I felt connected to that as an educator. But he also offers an analysis of various historical moments throughout the course of centuries, like the Haitian Revolution, Reconstruction, Brown versus the Board of Education, Jim Crow, just to name a few, to showcase how teaching and learning about Black history in real, meaningful, and truthful ways is just so important and so necessary, especially given the times we live in now, and how this knowledge of and the power of Black history is not just a central part of American history and the American experience, but also how it can offer us a path forward. And so I have a quote here from what Brian shares in the introduction about why he wrote this book and why all of this is important. He says, quote, "Most of us were raised on a curriculum shot through with white supremacy, but never named as such. We were fed superiority-infused stories of race, of nation, of stories of a heroic revolution in 1776, and of ever-expanding rights and freedoms. The simple shift of carrying on in a class as though other people are fully human and equal can be a shock to the senses. But only supremacists experience steps toward equality as degradation. Black history is for everyone precisely because it is not about promoting a new kind of superiority. Instead, by seeing the past in a new way, Black history offers an opportunity to begin to see ourselves, whether you identify as Black or not, in a new way too. What happens when we start to learn new stories? What might we then become?" So I loved that. I think there's so much we can talk about from this book. It's a great one. So we're going to get into it, and we're going to start with you, Stephanie. Where do you want to begin?
Love to start with chapter 1,
Yeah.
and that is called Race. And so Jones really unpacks how race was legally and socially defined in colonial America, illustrating that categories of race were very much invented to justify power in property structures rather than really reflect any biological difference. So Jones talks about biological differences in like how people look, including some like background information about differences that come about because of just where different folks have been living, closer to the equator, farther away from the equator. And yeah, I thought that was just really interesting because in the past, and kind of how I got my start in this work, was being a facilitator for a museum exhibit called Race in This Place, where we were able to actually have exhibits dedicated to exactly getting rid of all of these myths that come with race and how it came about. And it was also particular for me. I really liked it because I was talking to students as young as like elementary school, and we were also talking to folks who were doing DEI work on like a high level at the university that I was at. And it was really like fun having these moments that you have talked about with folks that were young and that, the information was digestible for, and also for folks who are making big decisions at the university. So that's where I wanted to start.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, and to build on that idea that race isn't biological but social, and a lot determined on how like cultural, social elites wanted to keep power structures in place. Or he talked about race being internally and externally defined. And so there's a quote from chapter 1 where he's referencing a book by Barbara and Karen Fields. And so he says, thinking about politics of race purely as a matter of identity is insufficient because its imposition from others often trumps self-identification. If Homer Plessy thought of himself as a white man, that wouldn't change how he was treated on the train. So I felt like that was an important piece for us to unpack too, as we think about like what passing looks like and how that it wasn't necessarily a piece of the book in this book of history in this book, but as a part of history and how people sort of escaped what white supremacy looked like for them and their own stories. And then also how white supremacy continues to operate today, where there's a lot of external imposition on and definition of who gets to be who and how.
Yeah, that's great. I actually highlighted a lot of what you two did. There was a lot in chapter 1 that really resonated with me. One of the things that he does in chapter 1 that I just so deeply appreciated is he shared a lot about his own lived experiences in that chapter. Mm-hmm. He does that throughout the book, but there were some in chapter 1 that just like it just brought me right in. And there were just a lot of connection points for me personally. So one example was from his experience in his high school days. So he says, quote, like many young black people, I internalized the idea that I would have to be twice as good to get half as much respect. Much to my dismay, my blackness seemed to be the salient thing about me. One of my classmates had a gift for inventing creative ways to make fun of my kinky hair, and he got enough people laughing to send me home in tears for a good part of my freshman and sophomore years of high school. I'm so grateful to good friends who saw me through this and brilliant teachers who nurtured my curiosity. But racism still stalked the hallways and classrooms. And so that story probably resonates for pretty obvious reasons. But beyond that, I also appreciated his work to connect his personal experiences to, a larger analysis of the issue of race in our society. And to your point, a lot of the biological differences in race and what that has meant for the treatment of folks. He also does some great work to connect this to real examples throughout history, like with what happened during and after Bacon's rebellion in Virginia in the 1670s as an example. And I was like, oh, I do kind of remember this. Thousands of people from all classes, both white and black, rose up in arms together to rebel against the settlement. And then soon after, laws were put into place to prevent black people from owning property, owning guns, participating in juries, serving in militias. And so black people were punished for that effort, even though those folks were working together. And using laws to do that only institutionalized that into the fabric of our society. And we know the impact of that and the systemic issues that come of that. And so there was just a lot that I appreciated in chapter 1. Yeah.
Yeah. And we see there's a lot of pushback today too of people who are siding with the people they're not supposed to side with as white people. Like, what's it look like to break the rules, so to speak, as a white person? That is like echoes of Bacon's rebellion to a certain extent.
Yeah.
There's Yeah, there's parallels there too.
Yeah.
I'm going to move us on to chapter 2.
Sounds good.
Okay.
So what I really liked about chapter 2 is that it gave us this idea that Black history really challenges the mainstream and dominant narrative about American exceptionalism, and I think who built America. And I feel like this really reframes the story of our nation by really recentering Black voices and events from a Black perspective, because they are often so marginalized, especially within our curriculum, elementary school through high school, through college, and through doctoral programs, I can say, as well. And it really feels like, for me, there's a myth of unquestioned national greatness, and that really obscures the struggle and the resistance and the work in the community that was being built outside of these kind of like dominant narratives. And so in the chapter he talks about Frederick Douglass and Malcolm X as good examples to rise up and bring that into our more like dominant narrative and being able to center Black voices.
Yeah, there's a lot in there in chapter 2. And to speak to the curriculum in K-12, there's a reference, I think it's in chapter 2, to a historical figure in Florida history. And as a Floridian, I was like, oh, yeah, he's correct. I did not learn about this person who ended up being like Secretary of Education, basically, for the whole state of Florida as a Black person during Reconstruction. Not history that I learned as a young kid in Florida. So there's a lot that's hidden. So in chapter 3, he starts talking about the Haitian Revolution as a big piece of Black history that has shaped what white supremacy has looked like as concepts and imperial choices that the United States and France have made. He talks about how those two countries are touted as being grounded in these liberatory ideas, and yet they did the most to keep Haiti in its place, so to speak, and to prevent liberty from actually taking root in Haiti. And so we see this contextualize the threat that Haiti posed to the world order. So US and France saw Haiti and their freedom as a threat to the world order of white supremacy and to the imperial control that France had at the time and that the United States started to build post sort of Civil War era. And ultimately as a threat to whiteness and a potential path to liberation as subverting the rules of race. And so he talks about Polish immigrants who moved to Haiti, and they were not trying to become white, right? Because that's not what was happening in Haiti. It wasn't a country in which people moved to become white. And so it flipped a lot of the rules of race on its head. And he talks about that being a potential path to liberation as we think about how we subvert rules of race beyond like our sort of conceptions of what white supremacy looks like then and today.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and there's so much to learn from the Haitian Revolution and the way that he talks about it and really everything in this book. And so I want to come back to that. But I'm going to move us forward to chapter 4, which is the last formal chapter in the book. And it stood out for a lot of reasons. It happens to be called Education, the Mightier Work of Reconstruction. So there's lots we could talk about from it. I feel like I've talked a lot, so I'm going to encourage all of you to read it. But one of the things that was particularly powerful about it was all of the incredible moments and periods throughout history that Brian shares that highlight just how resilient Black people have been in regards to education since the dawn of time. And despite every attempt to take education away from Black people. And so one of the most amazing things he says in this chapter is, quote, "Someone once asked me to name something from Black history that is important, but most people don't know. My reply was twofold. First, that Black people have played a crucial role in defining and attempting to realize the ideals of democracy in this country. And second, that they have always been uniquely focused on pursuing and expanding opportunities for education. Because Black education was criminalized for most of U.S. history, Black people's pursuit of it involved great risk and took place in secret. During the Civil War, these efforts came out into the open, surprising white people who observed them." He then goes on a little later to say, "Believing widely held racist myths that Black people were intellectually inferior, white people who witnessed these developments were surprised not only by the freed people's capacity for learning, but also by their ability to self-organize it. Many missionaries were astonished and later chagrined, however," historian James Anderson wrote, "to discover that many ex-slaves had established their own educational collectives and associations, staffed their schools entirely with Black teachers, and were unwilling to allow the educational movement to be controlled by the quote-unquote civilized Yankees. To the freed people, literacy was power." And so Yeah, there's so many great stories like that in this chapter. But I think there's so much to learn about and from the power of education in these stories. There's a lot to learn about just the power of education and opening our minds to new experiences.
Yeah, I would say chapter 4 was fabulous for me as well. I think, as you talked about, I think what I really got out of it was the importance of Black history as a lens for understanding rights and citizenship through education as well. And by framing education as a continuation of the struggle for freedom, and really it being a revolutionary project, for it being liberatory. And Jones really makes the case that knowing Black history for all, and I think for me, particularly as a white woman, knowing that Black history changes how I see citizenship here, democracy here, and really the potential for beautiful shared features.
Yeah, he challenges a lot, right? Like the history tells us different stories about who we actually are. Like when we actually pay attention to the real stories and not the myths that we're taught, it changes the narrative of who we actually are, which is also why 1619 Project has been attacked so much. And there's all this backlash is like, it's telling the story that political elites don't like. Yeah.
And that many folks didn't learn, to your point earlier.
Yeah. And you see the parallels because you talk about the attacks on, well, that's actually my point.
Yeah.
So we see some parallels between history and today. And this was probably one of my themes for the book. As I was reading through, I was like, oh, that sounds familiar. That sounds familiar, as I highlighted things. So in chapter 2, he talks about the way the Red Scare was inherently anti-Black, which is something that Robin D.G. Kelley has also pointed out of things that we've read by him. But Brian says, quote, in the middle of the 20th century, the United States government used the context of its conflict with the Soviet Union to police the boundaries of political allegiances. Anyone, and often but by no means exclusively, Black people, were deemed un-American or traitors or Soviet agents if they aimed criticism at U.S. society. In that context, Black activists sometimes hoped that their struggle could be consonant with anti-communism. So we see parallels to today. Like we see that backlash happening to Black freedom struggles over the last 10, 20 years really come about with a lot of different things that I don't need to get into naming in this particular moment, because in chapter 4, he also talks about it. And so he says, quote, as has happened so often, a post-racial consensus emerged in the aftermath of Reconstruction among white elites, who converged on the idea that the real problem was not that the idealism of Reconstruction wasn't achieved, but that it had gone too far in the first place. And so we see that that's what leads to the collapse of Reconstruction is like, well, we've done enough. We've gone too far. In the book, he talks about how the Department of Justice was created to squash anti-Black violence in the South. And then at one point they just said, well, we've done enough. Like it's time to heal. We've gone too far. And so then we see the collapse of Reconstruction and the rise of Jim Crow from that moment on. And I think we see some of those parallels now of people bending the arc for us, to reference back to the keynote, the moral arc of the universe bends toward justice. It bends toward justice because we bend it, because Black people have bent it in this country for centuries since the start. And when it starts to bend too much, there's backlash. And so we see that parallel from history into today.
That's a great point. And I think that's a great segue.
Oh, yeah. We're great.
So let's move on to the application portion of our show. You did it. I love when that works out. So this is the part of our show where we talk about how this book and our conversation about it apply to our everyday lives and work. My application comes from something that Brian says way back in the introduction, where he's discussing how the teaching of the American Revolution is an example of how teaching Black history requires a nuanced approach, if you will, especially considering and comparing it to the impact of the Haitian Revolution that we've been talking about and how that has traditionally been taught in schools. So he says, quote, critics may howl that this sort of discussion teaches young people to hate America without realizing that the stakes here have nothing to do with hating or loving the United States or trying to prove that one nation is bad or another is good. That this comes so quickly to our lips reveals how caught up we are in notions of national superiority, a cousin to the obsession with racial superiority. If we let go of superiority and embrace humility, we become open to genuinely learning from others. And there's a lot in there that I like about his analysis. It especially made me think, I think in my first read of it, it made me think a lot about the critical race theory or CRT nonsense that has happened recently. efforts to ban quote unquote woke teaching in schools. His point here is that we should be teaching our students Black history like the Haitian Revolution as well as the American Revolution, but it should be done in a way that honors the truth in that history. And his last point there about letting go about superiority and embracing humility and being open to learning from others is just huge, right?
Yeah.
I think it's the basis of what we believe in and what we believe in education. I also think it's a model that not only should our students embrace, but it's one we all need to embrace in order to be better citizens and better friends and better family members, better neighbors, and just better people. So, yeah. What about you, Stephanie?
I think mine is a great piggyback from yours. So my application is thinking about resistance and resistance community. So Jones highlights, again, the Haitian Revolution, but also just Black resisted movements throughout the book. So enslaved people's rebellions to abolitionists, civil rights activists, and really showing how ordinary people sustained hope, organized across differences, transformed social structures through collective action. And for me, it really gives me hope that these stories aren't distant folklore, and in fact, they offer very real living lessons about persistence and strategy and community that apply to how people can confront injustice. So my application of resistance is really just in everyday choices of how I show up at work, how I show up at the dog park, how I show up with friends, and thinking about participating in more community events or creating art with purpose, and really just showing up for neighbors, maybe through a mutual aid network or something in that way as well, which all can be really important forms of resistance that push my little pocket of society towards justice.
Yeah, and that reminds me of Adrian Murray Brown talking about small is all. And so you have to start from within to make change outside. So yeah, well said. Thanks. So my application's from the epilogue, which is called Back in the Library. So he says, quote, "In a recent research methods course, I told my students that if after investigating something closely and gathering new evidence, you end up thinking exactly what you thought starting out, you're probably doing it wrong. Learning is about struggling with new information and ideas, and it doesn't always feel good to revise what you thought you knew." Which ties into a lot of what we try to do here as we talk about learning and unlearning things and unpacking those they become uncomfortable when we realize that we've been fed myths, right? As we unpack those things, it's not always the comfiest thing to get here and talk about what it is that we're learning, but I appreciate him giving us this context of how he's also living that in teaching a research methods course. And yeah, so that was what stood out to me as application for this.
I love that. And I think there's broader applicability of that from just students in a course.
Oh, yeah.
All of us can do that. So I love that. All right. So now we're going to move on to homework. What do we want to do to continue our learning and unlearning work once we wrap up our conversation today? I really enjoyed this book, if you couldn't tell. And I think a lot of it had to do with Brian's writing style and the way he approached the writing of this book. And so I just want to learn more from him. He actually wrote another book that was published in 2024 called The Tuskegee Student Uprising, A History. So I thought it'd be kind of cool to check that out. And I don't know if you saw this, Aaron, but Brian was actually interviewed recently by Jesse Hagopian in the Rethinking Schools publication. And we read Jesse's book, Teach Truth, The Struggle for Anti-Racist Education last year.
Yeah.
And it was awesome.
Yeah.
And I would encourage everyone in this field to read it. So I want to check out that interview as well, because we have two folks who we've consumed on the podcast.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Good stuff.
Stephanie, how about you?
Yeah, I want to go back to the book, How Real is Race? Unraveling Race, Biology, and Culture from Chapter 1. Like I said, I was a docent for something like this, but that was over 10 years ago at this point. So I would love to get some more updated information that I can have in my arsenal ready to go and bring out when ready and needed.
Nice. Yeah, so my homework is another book. We have a running joke that we've got an unending list of books that we'll never get to, adding another one. So it's called Until I Am Free, Fannie Lou Hamer's Enduring Message to America. And it was written by Keisha N. Blaine. And so I'm going to quote a description from that. They say, "It lays bare the faults in American society and offers valuable insights on how we might yet continue the fight to help the nation live up to its core ideals of equality and justice for all." So that sounded amazing, especially through the lens of a really powerful civil rights leader who doesn't always get the attention that the men do.
Yeah, Absolutely. Very good. All right, homework across the board. I like it. All right, so that's our conversation about this incredible book. We encourage you to check it out. Thank you, Stephanie, for joining us today. Do you have any closing thoughts or anything you want to share with our listeners?
Yeah, I would love to leave folks with an invitation, one that might feel a little counterintuitive, but stay with me, and that is to slow down. I know rest and regulation can feel impractical or tough to find in times like these, but they really, really do matter. So just a reminder to pause when you can and to take care of yourself and your communities, because that care is the work. I hope y'all find small ways to breathe, maybe laugh, maybe dance, a bad bunny perhaps, and reach out when you're struggling, because none of us are meant to do this alone.
I love that.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for offering that. We all need those moments to slow down and check in with ourselves and one another.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. All right, Aaron, you're up next time. What are you bringing to the table in our next episode?
I am going to bring an article from The Forge called Our Prescription for Winning: Give Organizers What They Need to Thrive. It's written by Alicia J., Cara Park, and Rebecca Gorena. And the subtitle is, At this moment, our sector is immersed in a critical debate over what it takes to win, yet primarily scrutinizing current organizers in a rush toward correction risks getting the diagnosis wrong. So it's all about understanding what organizers are doing and what they're trying to do, and not rushing into a critique that potentially overcorrects in a way that doesn't help.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
We've read a lot of things by The Forge, highly recommend. They really focus on organizing and how to do it well. And so I'm looking forward to checking that out. All right, so with that, we want to thank you for joining us today. Many thanks again to our friend Stephanie for joining us. You know what we want you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with the people in your life, follow us on social media, including Instagram, TikTok, and Blue Sky. Check us out on YouTube and sign up and join us on Patreon to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes. Thank you for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about all of us. And we'll talk to you next week.